As we look around and try to estimate some of the changing values in our way of life, we realize that it is very necessary, wherever possible, to gain control of the conditions and circumstances that are moving us into absolute conformity. That is, intellectual and physical conformity with patterns. These patterns, for the most part, are sterile of creativity. And today, conformity is the law and the rule. And the human individuality is suffering desperately as the result. This loss of individuality stands for loss of resources. The moment the individual depends totally upon the group, he loses one of his primary mental attributes, that is originality. He ceases to be able to do things. He ceases to be able to think things through for himself. And there is no doubt that the general difficulty that we observe is partly due to such cause as this. The penalty upon the individual is very heavy. From his school years on, he is rewarded for conforming. He is rewarded for being like everyone else. He is punished for being different. If this meant that conformity brought security, brought happiness, brought cooperation with a broad program of essential constructive purpose, we might say that it is excusable. But what does conformity mean? It means the individual adjusting to others who are themselves unadjusted. It means that we do things in the same way that others do them, when we can constantly observe that other people are not happy as a result of what they do. We are therefore asked to conform to a situation which we do not trust, which we cannot accept, and which is not demonstrated to be useful. Against this conformity, we also have to face the cost of individuality. The moment we want anything that is individual, special, particular, personal, different, we come under the heaviest financial penalty. We want to dress a little differently, we come under a heavy penalty. If nature has bestowed upon us some peculiarity that we have to cater to, we are penalized. The individual who wishes to have certain space for self-expression or creativity is penalized. We are gradually taught to conform, that the easy way through life is to do what everyone else does. But unfortunately, these other persons whom we are supposed to copy are not having an easy way through life themselves. All the way along, the penalty on being an individual also reveals to us the penalty of not being an individual. So we are on a difficult spot. And the problem of trying to do something about it confronts everyone. Today we are concerned primarily with environment. That is the subject of our discussion. How we can maintain individuality under limited situations and without penalizing our economic condition beyond a reasonable degree. One of the things that sometime the American people are going to face is the expenditure of what they have according to the greatest good. We are living on a higher standard of life than we have ever known, but we have very little discrimination in our spending. As a result of that, we spend often in a way that produces almost nothing for the money that is expended. Certainly, we do not think through the importance of spending for the profit of our personal consciousness. We do not realize that it is necessary to maintain the individual as a being or as a person. And as a proof of the practical phase of that, when the individual is too greatly and too heavily penalized, when life becomes too boring, monotonous, and lacking in intellectual vitality, the person's earning capacity also goes down, and he gradually loses what social standing he may possess. Thus, the problem of trying to think one's way into a more complete life is important. The average person also in his daily living has very little opportunity for creativity of self-expression. He retires more and more into himself and is under constant external pressure. No one cares what he thinks, he feels, or he believes. Everyone else is trying to force their own opinions upon him. In the various positions in which he finds himself, rebellion is not always possible, in fact, seldom possible. So the tendency to escape back into self, and perhaps to be finally discouraged and give up all attempt at self-expression, is more and more noted. We find that in working with people. Those who would be or could be individuals have been so mentally and emotionally browbeaten by circumstances that they are afraid to be individuals. They're afraid to do their own thinking. They keep quiet until someone else expresses himself, and then they say yes. They're afraid to lead any thought pattern, or afraid to state by themselves any conviction which might be different or in any way open them to censure. And difference and individuality do open people to censure today. Now, in Japan, for example, over a long period of time, a certain situation somewhat parallel to this occurred. Japan has a very heavily populated group of islands. So heavy is the population, so overpopulated the region, that the individual, to survive, had to struggle definitely and almost desperately for what to the Japanese mind is survival, and that is the survival of self, the survival of the person under the pressure of conditions. The great gardens and wonderful estates of Europe and America were very rare in Japan because of the land problem. So gradually the Japanese mind developed the possibility of creating in miniature. They made little worlds, and in these little worlds they kept a certain royal prerogative. They rule these worlds that they created. I have seen in Japan a complete world in an area the size of the top of a dining room table. Here were mountains and rivers and valleys and temples and homes and forests and streams. In a small world, these people had sought to capture and preserve beauty. They needed creativity, and yet they were blocked by the mass population that moved in upon them in every direction. Of course, in the countryside there are many beautiful homes and some large estates, but for the most part, the Japanese people early took interest in this problem of retaining creativity. It would not have occurred to them to have bought such a garden, because the joy was the making of it. It would not have occurred to them to follow any map or chart and to reconstruct any existing garden. What they wished to do was to create, to express, to find some release for the impulse and instinct to do things, to be an individual. So in Japan we have the miniature garden, which has finally come over more or less to this country in the idea of the bonsai garden. The garden in a bowl on the top of a table. This garden consists perhaps of 1, 2, or 3 dwarf trees. 3 dwarf cedars equals a forest in a bowl. And these little cedar trees may be only 10 or 12 inches high. Why are some of these trees so terribly expensive? It is not unusual to pay $200, $250, or $300 for a dwarf tree, perhaps $500 or $1,000 for a very distinguished one. It is because of constant labor, thousands of hours of careful attention to the training and shaping of this miniature tree. Not only merely to shape it according to some special law, but to create within it a concept of beauty, a concept of personal spiritual release through the development of a symbol of certain dynamics within the personality. The tokonoma is another example of this same idea. To take a space, perhaps half the size of a closet, and to set this space aside for the continuous manifestation of art instinct. In this small area, set aside in a room or house, something of beauty must constantly flourish. This beauty not only reveals the atmosphere of the home, keynotes it, but gives to the Oriental mind a certain dignity. Such beauty cannot be created there by an interior decorator. It cannot be done hastily or thoughtlessly, because the tokonoma, or the little alcove dedicated to art in the home, is a symbol of the refinement and cultural attainment of the owners of the home. It must be their work, and it is their expression of maturity, of psychological intelligence. Because any individual, according to the Oriental mind, who has not the concept of beauty, has not the concept of home. Because home is actually man's personal opportunity for the cultivation of a way of life. Whether he live alone or not, whether he is one of a large family, whether he lives in a rented house or an apartment, a single room or a mansion, his place of dwelling is his fortress, his sanctuary. And the sign of his maturity is that he has placed within that space, whatever it may be, however limited it may be, something which indicates that every day he serves beauty, that he serves some instinct within himself. Oriental psychologists feel conclusively that this cultivation of a disciplined service to a constant ideal not only strengthens moral character in the individual, but makes that person a better member of a family, and may also cause this person to escape the temptations to crime and general depravity which marks so many who have no such dedications. So the tokonoma becomes again a challenge. It becomes merely a place It may be 3 or 4 square feet of wall in a single room. It may be the top of a dresser, or a little alcove, or a space set aside by the sections of a small screen. But whatever it is the place of self-expression. And it is also the place of dedication to service. I've been into several American homes where the tokonomas have been copied, and the little flower arrangements have been set up with artificial flowers. Well, I know the Oriental would not approve of it. Perhaps under certain conditions it is justifiable. But the purpose seemed to be to get away from labor, which to the Oriental mind is the reason why the tokonoma exists. It is expected that the person who is interested in civilization, in the development and maturing of his own consciousness, will choose to set aside 15 minutes a day, or a half an hour every 2 or 3 days, or perhaps an hour a week, simply as a priest in this garden of beauty which he has created. He is not expected to begrudge those few moments, because no person is really that busy. The only thing he has to do is to choose. And today in this country, we would consider it a great deprivation to be asked to spend a half hour arranging the flowers in one of these little gardens, when we might otherwise have the enjoyable opportunity of watching 3 murders on television. So the television addict is just too busy doing nothing. No matter what he watches on television, presuming that he saw the most magnificent educational program conceivable, that it was everything the television viewer of intelligence has hoped for, still that program is not as important to him as the procedure of getting down on his knees with a pair of shears, with vines and flowers, and creating something himself. All the listening and watching and looking in the world is not equal to doing. The Orient found that out a long time ago. And as we look at the rather shallow situation arising in our midst, we realize that much of it is because we haven't time to be thoughtful. And if we have no time to think thoughtful ideas in ourselves, we have no time to mature our culture, which will remain brittle and shallow as long as we remain this way. Now, the tokonoma may cause the individual a certain amount of inconvenience. He may find that he does have to learn how to arrange his flowers. The general Western attitude of grabbing a dozen and dumping them into a vase is not for him, because some way in the gentle austerity of this segregated area it does not fit. He must learn that the arrangement of flowers is an expression of psychological maturity. It may take 5 years to learn to make a truly artistic and truly mature flower arrangement, a meaningful one. But while the person is so disciplining himself, he is also learning to make other kinds of arrangements. He is learning something of order and something of beauty, and is beginning to realize why these things should be applied, these principles should be at work in his life in every department. He cannot learn to do something beautifully without facing the challenge of living better. That is the purpose behind the whole thing. Now you take one of these miniature or dwarf trees. Some people have said, and probably quite correctly, that the taking of the proper care of one of these rare trees is almost as great a task as raising a child. You cannot just let them go. You cannot stand them on the radiator until they die. You cannot put them on the windowsill on a cold night. You cannot permit them to continue without constant control. Or if you do neglect them, your dwarf tree either suddenly becomes a giant and takes over the entire establishment, regaining its natural instinct, or, badly mistreated, it simply dies. And you suddenly discover that this expensive piece of floral beauty that perhaps cost you $250 has died in 6 months from common neglect. If, therefore, you are not concerned with this expenditure of self, as the Japanese expresses it, you have to give of your own life to keep that tree alive. If you have no interest in it, no time for it, if you find that it interferes with all kinds of comparatively meaningless activities, then certainly it is not for you. But it is discipline. It is the thing which the American people lack, the power to say, this I will do, and then do it. Or the power to say, this I will do every day for a year, and then do it every day for a year. This kind of discipline we do not have. And because we lack it, many of our other activities go afoul. We cannot retain or preserve the continuity necessary to take care of our problems. Now we have, therefore, a number of situations such as the tokonoma, or the small garden, or the flower arrangement, or the ceremonial activities of Japan, like the tea ceremony. In these we have the indications of a sort of Zen quality coming into life. Gradually the individual is introduced to the life of thoughtfulness, the life of carefulness. The Japanese family that has used the same eggshell-thin porcelain tea service, there's cups that are just as fragile as eggshells, and I have seen sets of this kind that have been in the Japanese family and used every day for over 150 years without one chip, crack, or broken cup or saucer. Why? Because the taking care of these is a ceremony. The washing of them is a ceremony. They are put away because they belonged to the past, but also because thoughtfulness in the doing of anything is a virtue. Carelessness in the doing of anything is a vice. The most common thing, no matter how matter-of-fact or meaningless it is, cannot be done carelessly without weakening the character of the person who does it carelessly. Now, this sounds perhaps as though we were going to make life rather complicated. Actually, it does not make life complicated. I have seen groups move into situations where the Oriental mind, with its order, moved in upon a Western situation in a condition of disorder. I've seen, for instance, servants take over a situation in a Western home. A family that had been in despair because it could not take care of a home has found that one well-trained Oriental servant could take care of it completely and have half his time to himself, simply because he went after everything with a certain immediate and complete absorption in that thing. He made few mistakes. He seldom had to go back over the same thing twice. He was never in a hurry, and he never stopped. And in a short time he was through. Whereas the person who had only one interest, to get through, to get to something else, fell over himself, created more work for himself, and did everything that he did do indifferently and without basic interest in his subject. So the Oriental tells us that whatever we do in life is a kind of Zen. Every particular action that we perform from the moment we awake until we go back to sleep at night is a Zen ritual. A ritual which reveals to ourselves and to others exactly what we are. And the only reason that a good many of us get away with it is because other people are the same and do not know the difference. To be actually successful, however, does not mean to compete favorably with others. It means to integrate self. And here your thoughtful, disciplined existence becomes important. Most persons only assume responsibility when they have to. Therefore, symbolism plays a part in this. The person who builds the tokonoma in his home, or buys the little bonsai tree, or spends a good many dollars on a beautiful aquarium for tropical fish, expects to take care of them, or thinks that he expects to take care of them. In a short time, however, this caretaking becomes drudgery. But look in the larger world around you. The average person's job is drudgery. The average person's home is drudgery. School is drudgery for the young. Labor is drudgery for the old. We live in a concept of that. The Oriental mind, the Zen mind, says, let us take the concept out of the labor. Let us say that instead of all these things being drudgery, that all these things are opportunity for self-discipline. And that the disciplined self is the only self that is strong enough to protect us in an emergency. Therefore, self-discipline is not just because we have a desire to punish ourselves or to inhibit ourselves. Self-discipline is the means by which we make available to ourselves the total resources of ourselves, so that in whatever we do it better, more completely, more efficiently. Self-discipline gives us leisure. It gives us freedom. For there can be no one free who is a slave to his own lack of self-discipline. So the Zen would say, any symbolism that you set up, whereby you require something from yourself, something you cannot buy or hire done for you, something that creates in you also a constant little series of problems that have to be solved by your own attention, by your own faithful service of things. All this type of a relationship is important to the individual. Now, why is it, perhaps, that a person would not find the same satisfaction in some direct action that is not symbolical? What is the difference, for instance, between taking care of the yard of your house or making the daily repairs that are necessary and the bonsai tree? There's one difference. Your house you have to keep up, or your neighbors will criticize you. The repairs have to be made, or your utilities will not function. You have certain duties. These duties close in upon you and become a very drab program of constant interruptions to the things you want to do. But the psychology of Zen is based upon an entirely different concept. Zen is the dedication of the consciousness to something it does not have to do. That's the principle behind the whole thing. It is a dedication to something that we choose to do. and which may bring no recognition from anyone else, and has nothing to do with a competition based upon our common attitude toward life. The little tree we serve because of a creativity within ourselves, because of a need within our own psychic natures. We do it not for reward, because the tree can give us nothing but itself, and we have that already. The tree can never thank us, it can never pay us, it can never go out and tell us that we're wonderful. It can simply stand there in a normal and healthy condition as a result of our thoughtfulness, or it can droop and die and bear witness to our thoughtlessness. This is all that we can gain from the tree, is the satisfaction of gaining control over our own minds and proving it through taking care of something that otherwise could not exist or could not fulfill its normal purposes. If by any chance we think of merchandising, the significance of it is lost. The significance lies simply in what it does to us. Thus, in one way or another, we have to think about such patterns. Now let us imagine that you are not at the moment highly acquainted with this concept, and therefore that you would want to begin in some simple way to do something to exert the power of your own consciousness over the environment in which you live. If you have already achieved greatly in such activity, then you have already the experience. You already know what it means to do these things. But if due to circumstances you feel that you are so restricted in opportunity that you have not conceived of this, let us go to work and try to plan something about the way in which folks live, which you can do something about. Suppose we will assume for the moment that you live in an apartment, in a flat, or perhaps in a room, that therefore you have very little opportunity and very little incentive to make major changes. Almost anything you do would probably require the permission of someone else, the landlord or something. So the problem of major changes in your way of life would not be easy. Let us also suppose, however, that your room is pretty well filled right now. Filled with what? Filled with the symbols of the things that are important to you, whatever they may be. Usually, one of the points that we face in the modern way of life is the gradual accumulation of various things, most of which are comparatively meaningless. So we can begin, as the Japanese, Chinese, and other Oriental peoples would do, to indicate growth of consciousness by sitting down quietly, relaxing, and meditating as a procedure of thoughtfulness upon the process of eliminating non-essentials. We are all burdened with non-essentials. Non-essentials represent accumulations of things no longer useful, things that we no longer turn to, or as one person will say, things that are not very useful but are definitely too good to throw away. With this also will be the trinket and the knick-knack, the accumulations from friends, the old bridge prize. We would have given it away, only we left the club about that time and couldn't put the prize up for someone else to win. Various symbols out of the past, things that we're holding on to because they belong to our deceased relatives, and therefore have a certain sanctity about them. But whatever it may be in our modern way of life, we are probably in one of two conditions. Either we've moved into the furnished apartment and have absolutely nothing in it but the toothbrush of our own, or else we are cluttered. We are already surrounded by too many things. So the problem of clutteredness moving in upon us can be very serious. Also, in moving, as many people do now, we have a tendency to take things out of an environment in which perhaps they were happy and move them into a new environment in which they are not happy. That grand old cerise sofa that fitted into the old house magnificently does not look so well against the yellow and white striped wallpaper that we have just moved into. But it's too good to throw away. It's a practical thing. Of course, it may cause psychic debility every time we look at it, but still, what is a little more debility? We have enough of it anyway. So we are cluttered. And the beginning of mental integration, moral, spiritual integration, is order. And order is the ability to function freely, not interrupted or confused by our own possessions. For a cluttered mass of material things is just as difficult to work with as a cluttered mind, which can never arrive at any conclusion because it is falling over its own accumulated prejudices. So we begin to clear out the things that are not useful, the things that are not beautiful, the things that do not move us forward in consciousness. If necessary, we go right back to the four bare walls and start to build again. It is better if we have to get rid of everything we have and begin to be what we are. Now, this does not necessarily mean we have to refurnish an apartment or go anywhere beyond our immediate means or possibilities. It means, however, a gradual victory of our own consciousness over the environment in which we live. If we cannot afford many things, if we cannot afford all kinds of things we want, we may still be able to afford to dispose of some of the things we have, which may be the first step toward the organization of life. In the old Chinese days, most of the situations which would concern this person seeking law and order would not be of financial importance at all. In fact, even today, for the most part, this organization is not a financial problem. It is one of the few personal problems that is left to us. It is true that perhaps we can't afford an elaborate Japanese tree or something, but we certainly can afford to gradually become thoughtful and produce within our environment some symbol that is appropriate to our consciousness growth. We can produce the beginning of order, and that is to reduce confusion. And if the room is reduced to a minimum, we then begin to breathe more freely. We begin to think of the dignity of space rather than the dignity of mass. And we go right back to our original problem. The individual who thinks he is busy because he is doing many things badly. Whereas true employment is to do a few things well. The person whose mind is so cluttered with worries, fears, doubts, and prejudices that true thought is impossible. The effect of the environment upon the individual is prodigious, but the effect of the individual upon the environment must first be set in motion. The walls of our house become mirrors, reflecting our own taste back to ourselves again. And this taste moving in upon us becomes the basis of our civilization and of our culture, because it reveals us to ourselves. So presuming that some simplification has had a tendency to improve the matter, and that by circumstances we are not able or not privileged to make a major architectural or furnishing change, we are not permitted to pull up the rugs, or we're not permitted to tear down the drapes. We have to live within this because it does belong to someone else. And we should therefore adjust to it as graciously and simply as though we had control over it. The things we cannot change should cause us no worry. They are not ours. Man is not responsible for the things he cannot accomplish. Man is responsible only for those things easily accomplished which he neglects. Man is not presumed or required to transform the artistic standards of his landlord. He is not expected to cause a crisis affecting other people. He is simply to handle wisely those things which are his own, and over which he has a reasonable control. If, therefore, through the simplification of your own effects, you are able to reduce the confusion in the place where you live, it is a very good thing. I know one individual who had a very reforming streak of this kind once and did a world of good. This individual finally decided to throw out en masse, as a lump, 5 years' accumulation of old newspapers. He stored them in his living room. He just thought he might like to read back over them someday. But in a big moment he got rid of them and has been much better ever since. With those symbols in the Zen concept, the man who throws away the old newspaper throws away yesterday, which is a very nice thing to do. Also throws away yesterday's news and the things that concerned him yesterday. For yesterday is just as worthless as the old newspaper. Yet if you stack them up long enough, spontaneous combustion may result and burn your house down. And if you stack up these old yesterdays in yourself long enough, you can have a parallel experience that is very detrimental. So we'll assume this has simplified as much as possible, so we turn now to find the appropriate place or situation in which to create. If you have creative artistry, if you are a painter, a musician, if you have ways of creative expression, you probably may not need this particular discipline. On the other hand, I've known a great many artists who felt they needed it even more, because art is a strange thing. So much of art deals with pigments and brushes, or with chisels and mallets. Art is, again, a creativity on the part of the artist, but it lacks something that the miniature garden gives, and that is the molding of living substance rather than dead substance. The creation of something in life, the watching of life's processes, rather than merely the duplication of some moment in that process, as in the case of the photograph or the painting. But in any event, having found a proper motivation, you can set up, according to your means, abilities, and space opportunities, a little area in which you are going to create your Zen world. This little area can be on the top of a dresser. It can be on a small table or a stand. It can be of any size that is possible. It can be a shelf on the wall, a little niche that you hang up and put things in. But whatever it is a little area, and I know that a great many people have found the top of a chiffonier or the top of a chest of drawers especially suitable for the Western individual. This gives him a space of probably 20 inches by 30 or thereabout in which to create his world. If he is able to do so, he may be able to get a small screen or some plain background to put behind this. And here he starts a little world of his own, his interpretation of the tokonoma. Here he can put a few things that are meaningful to him, objects related to his cultural existence, the small works of art that he loves and that have become very valuable to him. I know I told one individual about this, went back a few weeks later and found about 200 things heaped up on that little square. Everything had been contemplated, nothing had been thrown away finally, and there was really a conglomeration that looked like the bargain table in some antique shop. But this person just couldn't throw any of them away. Everything was meaningful. Well, the answer was very definite. So we finally convinced them that they should clear out the top drawer right under the little top and put everything in there except one thing and bring that out. And after it had been there for a week, put it away, bring out something else. So that the individual, first of all, was able to give attention to this thing that was important. If it was important enough to save, it was too important to bury in a confusion. A little later, by this procedure, by the way, a number of articles disappeared permanently. After putting them out and living with them by themselves for 2 weeks, they weren't important anymore. The individual realized that the importance was a sort of mass importance. And breaking down the mass into the individual parts, many of these parts did not survive. The attention became bored with them. They did not mean anything. And in the course of about a year, 2/3 of the articles that had been so cherished were forgotten, neglected forever, because they really had no meaning. But when mixed up together with very important things, the entire group was accepted or rejected as one. Now sometimes space permits a little more enjoyable, a little more comprehensive exposition of artistry. A well-selected painting, a fine piece of sculpturing, a beautiful ivory, or something of that nature, offers itself to our attention. We then make another discovery. Perhaps we are living in what someone has recently called a jelly mold house, one of these things in which it's all glass and all this and that, and has practically no privacy in it. Or perhaps we're living in an old-fashioned house that has been remodeled or has not been remodeled. But one thing we learn as we go along, that whether it is ultra-modern or whether it is ultra-conservative, a well-built house or a well-organized house is always an appropriate background for art. Good art will live in any environment in which it can breathe, in which it can have space to exist. Art that is good also survives long association. That is one of the reasons perhaps why I rather favor this new problem or new policy that is coming up, which young artists are creating groups to rent paintings so that a prospective purchaser can rent a picture for so much a month, a very low amount, an original painting, can hang it in his room and see how he likes it. If in 6 months he still likes it, he can buy it. If not, he can take it back and rent another one. This way, he has the opportunity of living with the thing he may want. It also gives him a chance to see what this art does to him. For no work of art is without some effect upon the consciousness of man. And if this effect is wrong, the art is wrong for him. But you will find that good European art mingles and complements perfectly good Oriental art. Ancient art is perfectly compatible with good modern art. Everything depends upon the standard of greatness. The less creative examples do conflict, but great art does not conflict with other expressions of itself, regardless of school, time, or specialization. So a person can have good art in their home, but they also have to realize that one of the headaches of art, one of the reasons why people sometimes turn from it, is because of cluttering and because of bringing together pieces that are not good, or from overloading. A room that is to be lived in must be keyed around not more than one major art feature. You cannot key a room to several demanding and commanding art objects. A great work of art demands attention, commands respect. And if you have 3 or 4 of them in a room at the same time, they will confuse, because they will divide your own allegiance. You find yourself under the influence of different kinds of forces at the same time. All these forces may be good, but they cannot be compatible with the average person's undisciplined state of art appreciation. So the keying of the room demands one piece of art. It does not have to be large. It does not have to be expensive. But it has to carry with it a tremendous sense of satisfaction, of fulfillment to the person who has it. It must be something that he does not tire of. Something that continually reminds him of value. Not value in money, but value in experience. Value in internal relaxation and integration as a result of its presence. Remember, art in a home is not something you look at. It is something that is continuously seen by your subconscious. Its color and arrangement is in your consciousness, even though you may not directly look at it. Great art does not affect you because you stand by the hour in front of it. It affects you because you live with it. Perhaps only look at it for a moment occasionally, but see it constantly in association with the other things that you do each day of your life. If conditions do not permit the complete simplification of an area, then the center upon which this art object moves should be cleared as far as possible, so that there are as many feet of empty space around it as you can provide, so that it is alone, that it becomes completely self-expressing, that it is not drawn from one thing to another. Now, you may have in your possession now several such good art objects. If so, and your space is large, then that means they can be adequately displayed. But if your space is not large, put away all but one and change them every 30 days. In this way, you can give to each one the fullness of attention and understanding which it requires. And if these pieces have not been selected by critical standards, in other words, perhaps they've been given to you, or you have inherited them, or you have simply secured them because you like them at the moment. If you show them in this sequence pattern, you will discover that you will instinctively want to see some of them again more rapidly than others. That means your discrimination is growing, that you are not satisfied with things which were perhaps hastily chosen. If so, do not permit sentimental situations to prevent this growth. Demand from this environment all the strength that it can give you. Also, reveal in it as much order of consciousness as you possess. And as a result of such planning, you may observe less fatigue in your home. And if there are other persons around you, less contention. Now, if you live in a home with other persons, in which they equally have a right to have their own artistry or their own art concept respected, then you come into a very interesting possibility if you are living with mature persons or persons who have some basic instinct of value. It is quite possible that in a reasonable size space, both persons can have their own small world, their 20 by 30 inch universe, and that each one has a right to express through that their own convictions. And there is no reason why such dedications do not or should not help these persons to grow. Also in flower arrangement and in the arrangement of art, alternation between two persons, each one making their contribution 1 week or 1 day or 1 month, has a tendency to bring people into a common thoughtfulness. It is this lack of common thoughtfulness that underlies so much of the public trouble that we face today. It is the loss of these fine things that most persons regard as too unimportant to consider. Yet these are the details that make perfection, and perfection is no detail. These are the things which enrich life, and without this enrichment, the individual cannot fulfill his full responsibility. Now, moving also into various situations and patterns in life, the individual feels impelled usually to make some modification of the area into which he moves. Even though he moves into a furnished or rented place, he wants to put something of himself into it. He has to. Now, it is very wonderful to put something into it that is sentimental. For instance, the average family will certainly feature pictures of their children and things of that nature, symbols of peculiar and unique meaningfulness to that family. Also, however, regardless of the fact the environment is not our own, we do want to key it. We want to key it with some basic symbolism. It has to become in some way our home. Not merely the one we're paying rent on, but the place in which our consciousness must live in this world. A place which may change frequently, but at the moment it suddenly becomes again our home. And this sense of ourness, this sense of being at home, the natural rest of home, is forbidden by the apartment or room or house that simply looks like the public rooms of a hotel. And one of the difficulties that we observe today in modern building is while there is a great cleanness about modern building, and there is considerable efficiency, and there is much better light and ventilation than ever before, there is a great tendency also to coldness. Coldness in the sense of an emptiness that is not controlled. To the Zen, this could not happen. Because in a Japanese or Chinese room without a bit of furniture in it and without any ornamentation, you do not feel this coldness. You do not feel it because various elements of construction have been brought together for the purpose of creating a psychological warmth. And here in the West, we do not have that facility. One reason, of course, is, again, regimentation. We do not have individuality. One of these days, if present trends continue, practically all building will probably be prefabricated. You will order as many rooms as you want, and they will be dumped on your lot, and you can move in 3 days. This will be considered a victory of efficiency, and the nervous breakdown rate will go up 10%. Because this victory of efficiency is a purely mechanical victory. It is a victory of mass production over individual need. Now, we used to say that this had the great virtue of being economical. But today, the Victory House, prefabricated, is more costly than the carefully built home of 20 years ago. So we are not saving too much, except in terms perhaps of competitive contemporary prices. But to get away from the barrenness of an architecture in which the architect put nothing of his soul because he was working a routine problem. He was required to supply so many square feet of living at a minimum. And he built in everything that he could, and he prefabricated everything that he could, and he did everything possible to get the largest area of coverage with the lowest cost. Well, under such conditions as this, culture certainly suffers. But the moment you get into the modern home, you begin to sense this need for humanity, for the presence of the life principle of the individual. Of course, perhaps a great many who worship the modern without thinking or without experiencing accept it as it is. Why? Because its peculiar angular barrenness is almost identical with the consciousness of the individual moving in. He has this lack of ornamentation in his own soul. He is living a stripped life. He is living a life of complete dedication to efficiencies and to economies and to those kind of luxuries which keep his mind off himself. Such individuals probably will accept this emptiness, this barrenness, as significant. It fits them. And I've known persons who, coming into a place like that, were given a beautiful work of art. They put it in the house and it drove them crazy, because they could not stand the challenge of it. It asked them something. It reminded them of value they wanted to forget or did not dare to think about. It insulted them because in their education and their background they had never learned to love it. They had never learned that it was meaningful. So they were very happy to get rid of it and purchase in its place one of these chromed commodity art things like an elaborate percolator or something that did contact their level of efficiency and utility. Of course, the percolator was never efficient, but it was all right. But that is the way. These things frighten people. But it is a very serious problem when the individual is frightened by something better than himself. And it is something we all have to watch out for. Fear and indifference to that which should normally inspire us to further personal growth. When an individual says, frankly, that he has no need of anything good in his home, he is telling us something about himself. He is telling us that there is no need for growth in his life, that there is no need for beauty in his consciousness. And those are desperately bad things to tell anyone. Because if he loves beauty or has a feeling for fineness, he will demand some symbol of it. Now, going into a home that is apparently barren, we may be fooled occasionally, for we may find somewhere in that home the sign of the master builder, the sign that the person who has kept this place completely simple has done so because somewhere he has placed the dynamic that is so powerful and so strong that it could not stand any competition at all. Perhaps he has done the very Zen thing. He has taken his life, his body, his personality, which corresponds to his home, and he has swept it from attic to cellar. He has cast out of it everything in order that the pure light of his own consciousness might be entirely dominant. And I have seen homes in which it looked for the moment as though everything had been neglected. And then suddenly, at the proper period in your survey of the environment, just at the critical moment when it acted most powerfully upon your own preconception, the master key was present, came to your attention. You suddenly realized that the whole house had been built around an idea, a tremendous idea. This is a very high degree of artistic attainment. It is a degree which indicates that the individual's life is bound around a great idea. Otherwise, he would not have devised this concept or been able to execute it. Now, sometimes you will find an architect who is very good, and you will also find an interior decorator who is very astute. And you may go into a house and find a magnificent arrangement of values, and yet that house is inhabited by persons who have no discrimination in these fields whatsoever. This usually presents quite a problem, but it solves itself quite neatly in most cases. These are the people who are forever redecorating. They will have a beautiful place, they will have it well organized and well designed, and in a year or two they can't endure it anymore. It is not for them. They are not the person who built the house. They are not the decorator who adorned it. To them, it is not satisfactory because it is offering too much of a challenge. You can grow step by step, but you cannot change your entire structure of life taste instantly. So gradually, these persons who are not adjusted to something superior to themselves gradually begin to tear down this decoration process. In a couple of years, they redecorate. They bring in another decorator and change it all to Louis XIV. Then in a couple of years, they cannot endure that any longer, so the next thing is empire. Then in a couple of years, this is too much for them, so they turn to Cape Cod. And by degrees, this furnishing process goes on indefinitely. There are people who refurnish an expensive home every year or two. Why? Because of the restlessness and complete dissatisfaction in themselves. These persons are living in something they are not even trying to understand. You do not maybe realize it, but even the ordinary furnishings of a home demand something from the person who lives there. They demand a measure of understanding. They demand some kind of comradeship of mind or thought. They are not simply merely places to sit down or to read or to write. They are structures that require acceptance in our own subconscious minds. If we do not make this acceptance, then these things hurt us, irritate us, confuse us continuously. And the person who lives in a house decorated by someone else, even though they paid well for it, will not often be happy, because this decoration will not be true to the individual in every way. So we have, again, the evidence of the person's need to gradually dominate his environment. And just as we either express ourselves through our environment or we create defenses against it, so we start playing chess or checkers with the immediate world in which we live. Those parts of our environment which we cannot change and which we do not like, we have to consciously gain immunity to such influences. We must so completely relax that we cannot be irritated. And if the wallpaper is impossible, and yet we have to live with it, then our answer is complete Zen detachment from the wallpaper. There it is. It could hurt us. It could aggravate us. It seems to have been created for that purpose. But we do not need to be aggravated. So the things that cannot be changed, we must relax to, compensating for them by the establishment of positive things that can be done. Simple things that require increasing thoughtfulness. Now, many people have leisure more than they realize, and folks come to see me almost every day whose principal problem is the fact they have nothing to do. This is particularly true of older people who are also likely to either be living alone or to remain much of the time within the living area of their homes. Thus, they have a great need for the vitalizing of their environment against boredom, against loneliness, against this feeling or sense that they cannot escape into self-expression. They want something to think about and something to do. Well, the creation of the tokonoma idea for such a person is a tremendous challenge. If they have 3 square feet of space, they can create this kind of a functioning art instrument. They can create it almost without money, and certainly with no large expense. They can create it by learning to understand the values that go into it. If, for example, you wanted to arrange flowers in a small vase against a little screen, which could be your tokonoma, and maybe place with it one small art object in a dynamic relation. If you have such a concept in mind, you can do these things by the hour, and they won't please you very well unless you have trained yourself. So your next inevitable is to either buy a book or go to the library and borrow one that tells you a little bit about what these kind of things should be like. You then begin to educate yourself. Educating yourself in a way of life that is very significant in itself. The flower arrangement is not the main issue. It is the means, by means of which you are introduced into a psychology of a value appreciation. Gradually your perceptions begin to discover what is right and what is wrong. You learn to overcome the careless acceptance of asymmetry, for example. You look around you, things are in every shape, style, and form. Therefore you accept them as such. Gradually you learn, however, that this acceptance is not helpful, that it leads only to confusion in your own mind. But the trained acceptance enables you to pick out order. And having discovered order around you, you will react to order within you. So the person who really begins to understand the rules governing the arrangement of flowers, such as in the great Moribana school or the Ikenobo formal school of Japan, suddenly realizes that arranging flowers is like building a soul, creating a character, organizing a life. That nothing good happens by accident, and nothing great will be achieved without patience. These discoveries can transform a life. They can take away from us the unfortunate negative surge of impatience. we can also gradually release ourselves from this sense that our lives are bound and hopelessly limited by some circumstance. No life is so limited that it cannot grow within itself unless we place an arbitrary stop upon it ourselves. No one else can do that to us. And very few persons can prevent us from creating the little miniature garden, which becomes the symbol of the miniature garden in our own hearts, in which we give opportunity for beauty to flow out into self-expression. As it grows, it becomes more important to us. We then discover that in spite of our thoughts to the contrary, we had more time than we believed we had, and we had a few more dollars than we thought we had for this type of purpose. We suddenly discover that the need for some little thing to make this flower arrangement perfect, a very lovely or beautiful bowl to contain it, or a dish on which these little pebbles and stones and twigs could be tastefully arranged, became more important to us than that motion picture or that comparatively useless trip somewhere that we had contemplated. By degrees, our discrimination causes us to use the small means that we have, whatever it may be, for the satisfaction of the soul rather than the mere gratification of desire. And as our discrimination increases, our value sense deepens, and our tranquility of soul begins to develop. And with this little central focal point of beauty forever functioning in our own lives, we become better people. We are easier to live with, and our own life is easier for ourselves. We develop new interests, for once we discover the importance of the development of discrimination and value, we choose some natural field and go far into it. We discover that we open boundaries for avocational activities. No one who is really interested in understanding beauty can ever be bored. It is only when there is no stimulation to beauty that monotony creates boredom. So if we are in a situation in which we feel we have too much time on our hands, it is probably because we have not attempted the demonstration of artistry. In the East, artistry is very valuable in another point. You may say that art divides clearly in Asia between fine art and folk art. Fine art is not available to everyone as a profession, or even as an avocation. We cannot all be great painters, great musicians, great sculptors. Therefore, this kind of art, which represents the highest phase of trained technique, may simply not be for us. But folk art is for everyone. Folk art is what produced the cigar store Indian in America, the old-fashioned ship's head, the wonderful festooned barber's pole. It was folk art that gave us this wonderful religious art of the penitentes in the southwest parts of the United States. It is the folk art that gave us the totem pole and gave us all the beautiful ceramics and vessels that have been found in Mexico or Greece or Egypt. It was folk art, the art of the people, that gave to us the greatest participation that we have had in the cultivation of beauty. Today, great artists and great art critics are perfectly aware that folk art is just as great as fine art. And in many instances, it is greater. Because folk art is the true expression of man's search for beauty. It is the work of the amateur who is not studying with another master, but is studying with the master of his own soul. Folk art is the expression of the individual filling his need. He is not usually manufacturing for profit. He is manufacturing out of a vital necessity to self-expression. Therefore, folk art becomes in many schools the source of fine art. And art trends of modern man are mostly based upon the folk art of primitive peoples. So this type of artistry is available to every human being. It makes no difference whether you can draw a straight line or not. You do not have to know a palette. You do not have to be a skilled worker on a potter's wheel. You do not have to be an expert craftsman. All you have to have is the impulse to express. And if that impulse is nursed a little, given some opportunity to take over, that impulse will find ways to educate itself. It will gradually intensify its own program until it learns how to do what it wants to do. And gradually this will become a tremendous dynamic in your personal experience. Therefore, if there is any artistry in the soul, it is very nice to have at least one good example of something you have created in this world in which you live. You will then discover a very interesting fact. Friends coming in and seeing what you have done and comparing it perhaps with something else that you did not do will tell you how fine your work is. But you will not think so. You will have the innate and instinctive feeling that no matter how poor the work of someone else, it is better than yours. You know you made yours. Therefore, some way you now have to escape from this mass production conceit that if it's handmade and homemade, it's no good. And many people feel that today. They are ashamed to give a present if they made it themselves. They are ashamed to admit that they do these things personally. And they are always a little happier with bought goods. This situation is poor, desperately poor, and gravitates against the individuality which we so desperately need today. Even the simple thing poorly done, if it is done by you, and whether it is appreciated by anyone else or not, is far more important than the possession of a better thing which you had no part in producing. Now, it is true that you may have to compare these two values. I've seen them compared in the Japanese tokonoma, where a beautiful painting by a great master hung on the wall behind, a magnificent flower arrangement, perfect in every detail, was placed upon a little stand in front of it, just at the right angle. And down on the floor of the tokonoma, just at the right point, was a little modeled clay animal that had been made by the child of the family. This was art. This was perfect art. The little animal did not compare favorably with the other work, but it compared in the soul. It was created by the family that gathered there. It was their personal and simple expression of their child's love of creativity, desire to create. And this is the point that American people are losing, this desire to create. And the one place where we can still practice it and preserve it and keep it alive is in the home. And here we must create not because we want to keep up the property and sell it, but create because we want to express ourselves through creativity, to do it differently in some way, to make it something that is our own. And regardless of the small situation in which we find ourselves, if we have no more space than the top of a shoebox, to do something with it that tells the story of our own consciousness, reaching out towards truth, toward reality, toward value and beauty. The moment we make this achievement, we shall also discover another point of interest, namely that others who have the same vision, who have the same recognized need, will know ours. And we will not be held to be as foolish as we thought we were. And the things we have done will not be seen as amateurish as we believed them to be. For the greatest respect in the world by all thoughtful persons is reserved for others who have created, who have tried to break through the buy and borrow and come into the consciousness of self-effort. And if this self-effort is creative, if it is an expression of self, not merely a nice shop full of tools to make the same kind of things everyone has always made, but a creative expression, to restore, to regenerate, to revive, to rebuild, or to simply give expression to the motion of Zen consciousness coming through us. When we accomplish these things, our own lives become richer. We are able to create environments. We are able to receive the strength of environment. It moves in and creates a new life in us. It becomes a benevolent cycle. As we grow, we build a better environment. This environment moving on to us makes us better. Thus we become again better and change environment for the better. And so on constantly, like ascending a strange ladder. Every contribution that we make to reveal and to recognize, to act and to accept the reaction of action, all this motion is the real Zen motion toward maturity. It is the gradual victory of consciousness over mechanism, the victory of the individual over the group. And it is this victory which he must attain, or he will certainly suffer every infirmity of the group. He will find his own home going on the rocks. He will find everything around him falling to pieces, including his own health, until he realizes that man lives not by bread alone, or by skill alone, or by efficiency alone, but by virtue of a spirit within him, which must be nourished by beauty, thoughtfulness, and patience. To exhibit that spirit in his daily work and in his personal living is to gain a final victory over materialism as far as he is concerned. He becomes, like the Zen, timeless. His age is no longer important to him. He is simply living the moment, now, learning with magnificent joy some new creative way of expressing. He will find his years are not so long. He will find his time is not so heavy, and that he will not waste, as he does now, the opportunity to be happy. For happiness comes in this wonderful preoccupation in growth. The individual who doesn't even know he's growing anymore, any more than the flower knows that it's growing. The individual is simply expressing and fulfilling, and by that very circumstance is growing. For growth is expression and fulfillment. It's not getting behind a thing and pushing it with brute force and awkwardness. It is the unfolding of things in their own way and by the natural energies within them. And when man ceases to block this growth, he will experience it, and it will lead him into much gentler, softer, and kindlier ways than he has known, and will help him to preserve good values and to appreciate and support others who have good values. And by degrees, the little garden he creates in his home will give him a new dimension of perspective toward the universe around him, toward the great world in which he lives, and toward the human family of which he is a part. And as he grows and creates, he experiences the growth and creation of other things. He finds a kinship and a rapport with values everywhere. And he goes out in the road, by the road, and finds the little crooked stick that to him suddenly becomes a thing of beauty, beautiful far more than the straight stick, because in nature Nature is forever creating the dynamic of motion, not the straight line. Nature is forever breaking the line, creating interest. And man is a kind of a little crooked stick himself. And when he is placed properly in the proper environment, this little crooked stick suddenly ceases to be something abnormal and becomes the magnificent crowning element in a great work of art. Because art is not just conformity. It is not just using the straight lines. Art is using the dynamics of nature and revealing through the twisted trunk of the tree or the broken, twisted branch the tremendous dynamic of life. And each individual, through experiencing these values, becomes bigger. And when he sees the crooked stick or the deformed human consciousness, he realizes that it is not something to be cast aside, but that with proper use and proper arrangement, every human being can become a dramatic and dynamic part of a great living work of art. So by gradual philosophy, based upon these concepts, we grow into finer people and have, I think, a better opportunity of keeping our homes together and being successful members of a family establishment. Well, time is up. That's all we can do with it now. Now, we hear many people say that Buddhism is a great intellectual system, that it's mostly mind, that it's rather kind of cold, it's philosophic, wonderful, but that in some way it is deficient in the tenderness and sensitivity which we like to associate with religious convictions. So next week we're going to choose a subject which I doubt if it has been used very much, if at all, in the Western world, and that's a study of Buddha's great discourse on love. And it is part of one of the scriptures. It is part that is known to have been his, and it gives us a very warm and mature understanding of what love meant to the man who did leave his own family to serve the world, but whose family returned to him and took sacred orders with him. It is a very sensitive and mystical thing, and yet a very powerful one. And we hope that you will be interested in it next week. We also have still on the table some manuscript lectures on various subjects for your consideration, and some copies of The Light of Asia, Arnold's famous poem on the life of Buddha. We have a book on Quakerism, which is quite interesting and valuable, and a used edition of Bacon's Novum Organum. We have some, there's just so many, we'll suggest that you look them over. At the foot of the note it says, all nominally priced. That is perhaps the most important factor, and we should mention it at this time. But we have been gathering where we could the kind of books we think people would like to have in a library which must today also be very limited. It must be a small group because we cannot carry vast numbers of books with us. But fortunately we do not need to, because in the course of our reading, as in the course of our living, we find a few, and these we love, they serve us, and we like to think we serve them. Thus in books, as in all things, we become more discriminating, and our library, like our little garden, tells the story of our own souls. So we thank you very much for being with us this morning and hope to see you again next week.